existential crisis manufactured by the Liberal Party of Canada surrounds tariff wars. And so I thought it would be useful for us to engage in a commentary on tariff wars, what they mean, what they look like. And so today's commentary is entitled Tariff Wars, the Cost of Not Doing Business with the United States. We begin with a quotation from President Donald Trump, which reads, "Leaders, true leaders, take responsibility for the success of the team and understand that they must also take responsibility for the failure." Donald Trump's decision to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods entering the United States in February of 2025 has stirred significant debate and analysis among economists, policymakers, and we, the public. This commentary explores the multifaceted reasons behind this policy, delving into economic, political, and strategic motivations that might have influenced this decision. So let's look first at the economic rationales. Firstly, trade deficit reduction. One primary economic rationale for Trump's tariffs could be the desire to address what he perceives as an imbalanced trade relationship. Although the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada in goods, there's a noted deficit in services. Trump might view these tariffs as a negotiation tool to push for better terms in service trade or to reduce the overall trade deficit with Canada. What about protectionism? Well, Trump has historically favored protectionist policies to shield American industries from foreign competition. By imposing tariffs, he aims to make Canadian goods less competitive in the U.S. market, thereby encouraging domestic production there. This policy aligns with his America First approach, promoting U.S. manufacturing and job growth, especially in sectors like steel, aluminum, and automobiles, where Canada is a significant supplier. How about supply chain disruption? But the U.S. and Canadian economies are highly integrated with complex supply chains. We saw this during COVID. This is especially true in manufacturing. Tariffs could disrupt these chains, leading to higher production costs for American companies, but it might also encourage reshoring or nearshoring of manufacturing back to the U.S., aligning with Trump's goal of reducing dependency upon foreign manufacturing. Let's talk about the political and strategic considerations that might be motivating President Trump. First, border security and immigration. Trump has publicly linked the tariffs to concerns over border security and immigration. He has expressed great frustration over what he perceives as Canada's lax border control, facilitating the entry of undocumented immigrants and drugs, especially fentanyl, into the U.S. So the tariffs could be seen as leverage to push for stricter Canadian policies on these fronts. But there's also the issue of national security. Previous tariff impositions by Trump, notably on steel and aluminum, were justified under national security grounds, citing the need to protect domestic industries critical for defense. Although less directly connected, the new tariffs might be framed similarly, especially if there is an argument that Canadian policies or actions could directly threaten U.S. security. Of course, many skeptics say this is just a negotiation tactic. Trump is known for using tariffs as a negotiation tactic. By imposing or threatening tariffs, he aims to bring Canada to the negotiating table for better trade deals or policy adjustments. And this approach was evident during his first term when he renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA. The tariffs might be a signal to Canada that more concessions are expected, particularly in areas like energy, where Canada is a significant exporter, especially Alberta and Saskatchewan. What about geopolitical strategy? Well, there's no doubt that Trump seeks to counter China's influence. Although the tariffs directly target Canada, they could also be part of a broader strategy against China. By destabilizing trade with Canada, Trump might indirectly pressure China, given that both Canada and the U.S. are part of a complex global trade network where actions against one ally can signal changes to others. And then there's the question of strengthening domestic political base. Tariffs could appeal to Trump's voter base by appearing tough on foreign trade, protecting American jobs, and addressing security issues. His base often supports a hardline stance on immigration and border control, and these tariffs could be framed as part of that broader MAGA narrative. Then there's the question of rebalancing global trade. Trump's administration has shown a tendency to challenge established trade norms and institutions, aiming to rebalance what he sees as unfair trade practices globally. The tariffs in Canada might be part of this overarching strategy to recalibrate trade relations where the U.S. has more favorable terms. In terms of economic impact and domestic support, there's the issue of boosting domestic industries. Now, here, there's an argument that these tariffs could benefit certain U.S. industries by making Canadian products less competitive, encouraging consumers to buy American. That seems to be one of his goals. This could lead to job creation in the U.S. or preservation in sectors like automotive, agricultural, and energy, where the U.S. competes with Canada. In terms of revenue generation, these tariffs generate revenue for the U.S. government, and Trump might view this as an additional source of funds, especially if other revenue streams like taxation are under reconsideration or reduction. Trump has shown a history of providing tax cuts to Americans. In terms of consumer and business response, while the policy might face opposition from businesses reliant on Canadian imports due to increased costs, it could garner support from consumers if framed as a move to lower drug prices or to enhance security. However, the actual consumer impact might be negative due to higher prices. What about critiques and counterarguments? Well, let's talk about economic retaliation. Critics argue that this move will prompt Canadian retaliation, which it did, leading to a tariff war that could harm both countries. Canada has a history of responding to U.S. tariffs with counter tariffs, which historically have not only targeted goods, but also politically significant regions or commodities in the U.S. And then there's the threat of disruption of integrated economies. The North American economy, particularly industries like automotive, operates on an integrated supply chain model where goods cross borders multiple times. Tariffs could disrupt this, leading to higher costs, job losses, and inefficiencies. What about the impact on free trade deals? Well, many argue that these tariffs go against the principles of free trade, which have generally been beneficial for both countries. The U.S.-Canada trade relationship has been one of mutual benefit, and tariffs could unravel decades of economic integration. So overall, Donald Trump's imposition of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods entering the United States in 2025 appears to be driven by a combination of economic protectionism, national security concerns, negotiation strategy, and, of course, political posturing. While these tariffs might aim to reduce trade deficits, protect domestic industries, and leverage better border security from Canada, they also carry the risk of economic retaliation, disruption of supply chains, and potential harm to both nations' economies. The move reflects Trump's broader strategy of using trade as a tool for both economic policy and geopolitical maneuvering, though the long-term benefits and costs of such an approach remain subjects of intense debate, as we have seen. Whether these tariffs will lead to a renegotiation of terms, a broader trade conflict, or a shift in the economic dynamics between us and the United States will largely depend on the responses from Canada, the resilience of our integrated markets, and the broader implications for global trade. So how has Canada responded? Well, Trudeau hastily assembled the premiers and announced the following week that he had taken a Team Canada approach, which already shows signs of falling apart. The collective response of Canada to expected Trump tariffs was then predictably declared to be a negative one involving the imposition of counter tariffs. Premier Doug Ford of Ontario stated that counter tariffs would be Ontario's primary response, even before it was known what specific tariffs Trump was proposing. Premier David Eby of BC hysterically proclaimed that his province was preparing for economic war with the U.S. And Liberal leadership candidate Chrystia Freeland, the former finance minister who left the country with a $60 billion deficit and whom Trump most likely regards as the Canadian equivalent of Kamala Harris, trumpeted that she was the best person to lead Canada in its future relationship with the U.S. But is not all the above largely foolishness? Does not a common sense approach the tariff threat suggest going back to square one and analyzing it in the context in which it was first made? Trump initially made tariff threats for the stated purpose of forcing Canada and Mexico to get serious about stopping the uncontrolled and illegal movement of unwanted migrants into the United States. Common sense then suggests that Canada's initial response to Trump's tariff threat should have been positive rather than negative, and that the Canadian response to the new Trump administration should have prioritized measures to stop the violation of U.S. borders by illegal migrants. What needed to be said was something like this: here is what Canada's federal and provincial governments are doing to stop this illegal activity, and what we, Canada and the U.S., can do cooperatively to secure North America from this threat. No need now to threaten tariffs and retaliatory counter-tariffs, so let's get on to some real business. Trump, being a businessman of sorts and a deal maker, common sense further suggests bringing a positive response to an item which clearly is on Trump's agenda and which also happens to be very much in Canada's interest: energy security. This is a subject dear to Trump's heart, referenced in his inaugural address, and a front on which Canada can lead from its strengths, not its fears. There are few economic fronts on which Canada surpasses the U.S., but the truth is that, as the second largest nation on Earth, by landmass, Canada possesses some of the largest stocks of natural resources on the planet. Thus, surely, common sense suggests that the most important component of Canada's response to the Trump administration should be making North America more self-sufficient, especially with respect to energy. What, though, would a tariff war potentially look like for Canada and the U.S.? Well, let's consider the economic impacts of a tariff war. The economic landscape of North America is heavily influenced by the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, two countries whose economies are deeply intertwined through trade, investment, and shared borders. A tariff war between these nations would not only reshape their individual economic trajectories, but could also have broader implications for global trade dynamics. So let us explore the multifaceted economic impacts that a tariff war between the U.S. and Canada might entail, examining effects on trade, industries, consumers, employment, and international relations. Let's talk about trade disruptions first of all. The first and most immediate impact of a tariff war would be on the volume and nature of trade between the U.S. and Canada. In 2023, bilateral trade exceeded $800 billion, making Canada the largest trading partner of the U.S. and vice versa. Tariffs would increase the cost of goods crossing the border, leading to, first of all, reduced trade volumes. Higher costs would reduce the competitiveness of goods, leading to a decrease in both exports and imports. For instance, Canada exports like lumber, oil, and agricultural products would face higher U.S. tariffs, potentially redirecting trade to other markets or reducing it altogether. Next, a shift in trade patterns. Companies might seek alternative suppliers to avoid tariffs, potentially benefiting other countries like Mexico or the EU. However, this shift is not instantaneous or without cost, as new supply chains need to be established, often at a high operational cost. And then there's retaliatory tariffs. Canada would likely retaliate with tariffs on U.S. goods, particularly affecting sectors like automobiles, machinery, and food products, as we have seen. This reciprocal action would only compound the negative effects on U.S. exporters. Let's talk about the impact on specific industries. Automotive. The North American auto industry operates under an integrated supply chain. Tariffs could disrupt this, leading to higher production costs, job losses, or relocation of manufacturing. Given that vehicles cross the border multiple times during production, even small tariffs could significantly increase costs. How about agriculture? Both countries are major exports to each other in agriculture. Canadian dairy, beef, and pork would become more expensive in the US, while US grains, fruits, and vegetables would face similar hurdles in Canada. This could lead to price increases and supply chain disruptions, especially for consumers. What about energy? One that's near and dear to Alberta. Canada supplies a significant portion of U.S. energy needs, particularly oil. Tariffs on oil could lead to higher energy prices in the U.S., affecting everything from household budgets to manufacturing costs. And then there's services. The service sector, including finance, insurance, and professional services, might see a more nuanced impact. While less directly affected by tariffs, the economic downturn in traded goods could lead to reduced demand for services, having a downward effect on the economy. What about the consumer impact of a trade war? Well, of course, there's increased prices. With the cost of imported goods rising due to tariffs, consumers in both countries would face higher prices for a broad range of products, from daily necessities to luxury items. What about consumer choice? Well, the variety of products available might decrease as businesses pivot to tariff free or lower tariff goods, potentially reducing consumer choice. And then there's inflation. If tariffs lead to sustained increases in the price of goods, this could stoke inflation, particularly in sectors where both countries have significant trade. In terms of employment and economic growth, we have to consider job losses. The immediate impact would likely be job cuts in sectors most exposed to tariff increases. The automobile sector in particular could see significant employment reductions due to decreased demand and increased costs. Economic slowdown. Both economies would likely experience a slowdown as business investment might decrease in response to market uncertainties and higher costs. And this could lead to a broader economic contraction, reducing GDP growth rates. Unemployment. Increased unemployment could follow, particularly in regions heavily dependent upon cross-border trade, like the manufacturing belts in both countries. And then there's the long-term structural changes that could result from a trade war. For example, industrial realignment. Over time, industries might relocate or restructure to mitigate tariff effects. For instance, U.S. car manufacturers might shift more production south to Mexico or even back to the U.S. to bypass Canadian tariffs. And then there's supply chain reconfiguration. Businesses would need to adapt by sourcing from within or from other countries, potentially leading to a less efficient supply chain in the short term, but a more resilient one in the long term. Well, with a tariff war pending between Canada and the United States, our lame duck prime minister finally blinked, brokering a short reprieve to meet Donald Trump's demands. Justin Trudeau tweeted this out recently. He said, "I just had a good call with President Trump. Canada is implementing our $1.3 billion border plan, reinforcing the border with new choppers, technology and personnel, enhanced coordination with our American partners, and increased resources to stop the flow of fentanyl. Nearly 10,000 frontline personnel are and will be working on protecting the border. In addition, Canada is making new commitments to appoint a fentanyl czar, whatever that is. We will list cartels as terrorists, ensure 24/7 eyes on the border, launch a Canada-U.S Joint Strike Force to combat organized crime, fentanyl, and money laundering. I have also signed a new intelligence directive on organized crime and fentanyl, and we will be backing it with $200 million. Proposed tariffs will be paused for at least 30 days while we work together." That sounds like good news, or it could be, at least temporarily. It seems that diplomacy has won the day and averted a tariff war between two historic trading partners. As Premier Danielle Smith noted in her most recent public statement, quote, "I am greatly heartened to see that U.S. President Donald Trump and the Government of Canada have agreed to a plan to crack down on fentanyl trafficking and other illegal activities at our shared border. The appointment of a Canadian fentanyl czar with authority to coordinate a massive joint effort with the United States to target fentanyl traffickers is something Alberta has been calling for since it became clear in our discussions with U.S. elected representatives and administration officials that this would be a critical part of reaching a deal to avoid tariffs. Diplomacy has won the day. Let us ensure that continues, as we know there is much more work ahead of us. I once again call on our federal government officials and my fellow premiers to de-escalate rhetoric, abandon any non-tariff measures for the time being, and turn our efforts entirely to advocacy and good faith negotiation. There are so many win-win solutions on trade and security between our two nations. Let us turn this crisis into an opportunity to find them for the benefit of Canadians and Americans." End quote. May God bless America and Canada too.